One of the subjects that I often cover in my speeches is the subject of resilience. Now, a lot of the written material on resilience and a lot of the research, whilst fascinating, can be a little bit difficult to explain in a short period of time. So to help frame that, I'm going to use something else that I talk about regularly when I speak, something called storytelling. And you probably noticed that I'm from Scotland, and there's a story from Scotland that it's not particularly well known in Scotland and almost unknown outside Scotland. And it's the story of a man called Joseph Knight. Hardwired into the minds of every Scot is the 1745 Jacobite Uprising. What's not so well known is what happened around and after the uprising, when the Jacobite forces were defeated by the English in Culloden Moor. Because of money, things perhaps didn't go as everyone knows. And what happened to many of the senior Jacobites? Well, they were executed, but their children who still inherited the money were actually not executed, and they were allowed to leave the country. And one such family were the Weathermen family, and one such individual was a chap called John Weathermen. And like many other Scottish children from landowners and famous Jacobites, he was sent to Jamaica. When he arrived in Jamaica, he had no business, he had no connections, but like many Scots of the time, they're very industrious. And John proceeded to form one of the largest sugarcane companies in Jamaica. Now, at the time, the way things worked were not as they are today. And one of the primary ways that they saved money and made their organisation successful was to employ slaves. Now, John, by today's standards, was a decent enough man, certainly by what the records suggest about him. He was a kind man. And one day he went to the slave trade, which was like a market, and the people would come off the boats from Africa. And people would then purchase, a bit like you see on the television, they would purchase slaves for their bulk or their potential to bear children. Unfortunately, some children were also on the ships that came from Africa. And in one particular case, a very young lad, they think he was about 8, was left at the end of this particular trading day. His mum and dad had died on the ship, and he was scared and he was lonely and he was on his own. So the story goes that Weathermen bought the boy. He took pity on the boy and took his hand and took him back to his house. He then named this young boy Joseph Knight, and said, okay, you won't work in the fields, you're too young, so why don't you become my houseboy? So over the next few years, Joseph did various things in the household. But John took a shine to Joseph and allowed Joseph to do things like learning, and he taught him how to read and write, and he became an integral part of the Weathermen family. And it's fair to say John became very, very proud of Joseph and what he achieved. Now, as often happens, politics began to play in Joseph and Weathermen's life once again, because in 1769, the Scottish landowners and the British government decided they want to bring back the former Jacobite children to Scotland. They were after their money. So John sold up his business in Jamaica and moved back to Scotland. But he was so fond of Joseph, he took Joseph with him, and they set up home in Perthshire in Scotland. By this time, Joseph was a very educated young man, but he was still a slave. In other words, he had to work in the household whether he wanted to or not. It so happened when Joseph was working in the house, he fell in love with one of the other staff, a young lady called Annie. Annie and Joseph started to have a relationship, and Joseph wanted to take Annie out of the household and actually to go away and form his own household and have his own family. So he went to John and asked John, can I have my freedom? Can I leave service or perhaps get a job with you so I can afford to have my own house with Annie and we can have children? And this is where the story changes. Despite John Weathermen's feelings for Joseph, he was of an era where he thought he had the right to say that he owned Joseph. So he said to Joseph, no, you cannot leave the house. You must remain in servitude to the house. Now, bearing in mind it's 1772, Joseph is now an educated young man, and he decides, inspired by the Somerville case in England, that he would take John Wedderburn to court over his right to freedom. Wedderburn wasn't very happy, and when they went to the Perthshire court, Wedderburn exerted his influence on the court, and Joseph lost his case. He was not set free. But Joseph didn't give up at that, and Joseph decided to take his case to the Court of Session in Edinburgh. And again, he put his case together, he went to the Court of Session, he claimed his freedom. But again, under the influence of the Wedderburn family, Joseph lost his case. He was left with one final option, and that was an appeal against his situation as a slave. During this time, in Scotland, something else was happening. It's known as the Scottish Renaissance, and it was when the intellectual capital of Scotland was starting to develop and to change and influence the world. People like John Smith were having a huge influence on the way the world saw Scotland, and indeed how they saw themselves, their economies, etc. At that time, unbeknown to Joseph, James Boswell and Samuel Johnson, two of the key members of the Renaissance movement in Scotland, became interested in his case. They offered to support his appeal against his situation as a slave. So finally, with their support, Joseph took his case to appeal. And he won his appeal. Joseph was set free. So from that point on, in Scots law, slavery was not allowed. Despite Wedderburn's best case about the commercial viability of his organisation and his business, and despite the commercial pressure being put on the Renaissance judge and the Renaissance thinking at the time, they voted for freedom. Having won his case, Joseph did something else that I think is beautiful. Joseph could have become very famous and could have made a lot of money from winning his case. But rather than that, what Joseph did was he took Annie's hand and they disappeared. There is no record of what happened to Joseph after he won his case, despite the fact that he changed Scots law and helped to influence the world thereafter. Of course, not everybody celebrated the end of slavery in Scotland, and one of those people was a chap called Henry Dundas, and he fought tooth and nail for Joseph not to win his case, but he lost. However, in a very famous part of Edinburgh called St Andrew's Square, there's a monument to Viscount Melville, and this is this chap, Henry Dundas. How I would like people to think about this statue is that rather than Dundas being atop it, we have Joseph Knight looking through Dundas's eyes at Edinburgh and the world below him. So hopefully you found that story interesting. I think it's quite beautiful, and I love the way he just disappeared at the end. It's such a beautiful way, and counter to what a lot of people do these days about fame and wanting money. He got his freedom and he disappeared. It's quite beautiful. But what Joseph really showed more than anything else was resilience. He didn't give up when he lost in Perth. He didn't give up when he lost his case at the Court of Session. He fought his case right to the very end. But of course, the other thing he had was a little bit of luck. Because if it hadn't happened during the Scottish Renaissance, perhaps slavery would have taken a lot longer to be banned in Scotland and the United Kingdom than it really did.